and my thanks also to Jennifer Cow, to Greg Potts, and everyone at the SAA who were orchestrating my invitation here. It's a real delight to be speaking to you all. I really love talking at museums, or at least next door to them. But to be able to speak to an audience of museum enthusiasts and docents, this is a real pleasure for me, so thank you. Well, today, with my topic, the Afghan discovery of Buddha, I'll be speaking about developments in the 20th century, particularly the first half of the 20th century, in which Afghan intellectuals and scholars and indeed statesmen, working together with their European counterparts, discovered, or at least publicized in the public sphere, as we'll see, through a number of texts and other publications I'll be looking at, the pre-Islamic Buddhist period and more broadly pre-Islamic history and indeed art history and archaeology of Afghanistan. I'm not myself an archaeologist, I'm a great enthusiast of archaeology from my childhood, so I'm not an archaeologist, nor am I an art historian, but I am a historian of Afghanistan among other places, and particularly a historian of the modern period. So what I'll be talking about today is in a sense, the reception of archaeology and the reception of broader discussions in art history, Buddhist art history and beyond, in Afghanistan in the 20th century. And in that way, I'll be telling then the prehistory of art historical and archaeological studies before, of course, the most famous archaeological, or most infamous archaeological event of Afghanistan's modern history, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in March 2001. I've been asked to show you lots of images, so there will be plenty of images today. Most of them, I think, unfamiliar. Most of them draw on my own research, whether in Kabul, in the National Archives, in the National Museum, and in many cases, moreover, in libraries on Afghanistan around the world, whether in the UK, in Paris, and also, perhaps most strangely, in Nebraska, where there's perhaps the best, or certainly one of the best, the Arthur Paul collection of Afghanistan works, one of the best Afghan studies libraries in the world, in the middle of the cornfields of Nebraska. So I'll be showing you lots of images then that I hope will be unfamiliar to you, and as I say, drawn on my own research and here and there on others as well, which I'll try to acknowledge. So, the end of the Bamiyan Buddhas then in March 2001. I think it was at the end of that month, or in early April, that I was a grad student at the time, but sitting at a pre-arranged conference at the British Museum devoted to, among other things, Afghanistan, and the sheer horror that in the audience then among various speakers, including Paul Bernard, the former director of the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan, about which I'll be talking about more today, the sheer horror and shock that the Taliban had actually carried through their threats in what was, after all, a very deliberate act of, so to speak, to coin a term, anti-cultural diplomacy. The Taliban were very well aware that the Bamiyan Buddhas were perhaps certainly the most famous archaeological site within Afghanistan. It was a very deliberate act then, of course, that it was filmed and publicized by the Taliban. But what I want to be suggesting today, that there's a richer cultural and intellectual history within 20th century Afghanistan that Afghans themselves were involved in. And in many ways, the Taliban's decision to destroy the Bamiyan Buddhas was not only a deliberate act of anti-cultural diplomacy overseas or abroad, but also very much part of an ongoing battle, as it were, Afghanistan's own culture wars within the 20th century about defining Afghanistan's own historical identity, its past, its present, and indeed its future. Whether it was to be an Islamic state, indeed a state dominated by Pashtuns, or a state which is more pluralistic and aware of its pluralistic pasts, and indeed its presence, not least its pluralistic present, not least with the Hazara, Shias, and other people in Afghanistan. Of course, as many of you might know, the Bamiyan Buddhas in the Bamiyan area, or the Hazarajat region, were the region where the Shia Hazaras live still to today, who were among the other human victims of the Taliban. I won't be speaking much about the Taliban today, and I'll be speaking about what, in the memory of many Afghans, certainly is a much happier period in their history. And an overview of what I'll be speaking on today then is a series of interactions. As a world historian and as a historian, as was mentioned earlier, of what I've called the multiple globalizations of Islam and Muslims, I'll be talking about the series of global intellectual, archaeological and art historical based interactions between Afghan scholars and politicians and their European, and particularly their French, but also some of the other European counterparts in the 20th century, and particularly after 1919. Why is there this very clear date, 1919? Well, 1919 was the date of the short-lived Third Anglo-Afghan War. And as a result of that Third Anglo-Afghan War in the spring of 1919, Afghanistan gained control of its own foreign policy. It started to open its first embassies and consulates abroad, particularly in Paris, as we'll see. And as a result, Afghanistan tried to, the newly independent, or newly at least fully independent state of Afghanistan, started to develop its own diplomatic and particularly its cultural diplomatic efforts in a way that would try to outreach the Russian and British imperial axis or imperial enclosure of Afghanistan by reaching out to Germany and to France in particular, which it regarded as neutral powers with whom it might work, Afghans might work to escape the clutches of the British and Russian, and of course by this point the incrementally Soviet empire. So that's why 1919 is this extremely important date, and we'll be sort of seeing a number of dates rolling after 1919 in the early 20s and early 30s as the implications, the cultural, art historical and archaeological implications of 1919 started to find institutional and broadly art historical effect. And what I'll be focusing on particularly then within that larger political and cultural context then is the rise of pre-Islamic history and pre-Islamic art history for our purposes today within Afghanistan, among Afghan scholars, in dialogue, in interaction with French archaeologists in particular. And what we'll see then as I go in through, particularly to the second half of my lecture today, was how this led to radical changes in Afghan historical identity. And what I mean by that is radical changes in the ways Afghans themselves, or at least Afghan intellectuals and Afghans in the public sphere, which is developing through the spread of printing, radio, and then television across Afghanistan's 20th century, changes in the way Afghans perceived their own past, their historical identity, beyond the ways in which history was written in Afghanistan up until really the late 1920s and early 30s. And again, I'll be talking about some of these history books and showing you some of their images, which fortunately the spread of printing in Afghanistan came with the spread of art printing as well. So there'll be some visuals there. So the prehistory then, if you like, of the culture wars in Afghanistan that culminated tragically in the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. Well, let's start off then with a bit of context, and though I'm not a philatelist, I find stamps can tell us a great deal in a very small and contained way. So I'm going to look at 3 stamps here and use them to give us an overview very quickly of developments within Afghanistan at the state level in the early 20th century. So if we look at the earliest, or almost the earliest postage stamps in Afghanistan in the reign of King or Amir Habibullah, the ruler who I'll be coming back to, who ruled from 1901 to 1919, and was one of who was assassinated in 1919, just before the Anglo-Afghan War. He was actually politically much closer to the British than his successor who declared the war. But if we look at the stamp here, we get a sense then summed up, if you like, of the official state insignia of Afghanistan. Here on the stamp, we can see several things. One then is that at the center here we have a mosque. We have at the bottom there, written at the top there in Persian script, we have the older Persian, indeed Indo-Persian term for mail, post, dak khana. And the reason I'm bringing that up is that we'll start to see these kind of rapidly effective international interactions taking place in Afghanistan very soon. I forgot to ask at the back, is there a pointer on here as well? Oh, it's the top one. Okay, yeah, so here we see the word Darkhana. And this is then, as I say, kind of a small stamp. And we can actually see here that even in terms of the printing technology, so to speak, this isn't what we think of as a stamp nowadays, lick and paste. This is quite literally a stamp, something that's stamped. So, 1909. We'll start moving along and we'll start to see a number of changes. The first, here then by 1927, so we've moved on 18 years, thereabouts, and we can start to see already that there's been quite a shift here, and that insignia is the same, but it's massively shrunk. And what we have here is a much more, if you like, a much more dynastic type of insignia here, signifying the state. And that's not entirely surprising, because it's Amanullah, the ruler, who actually changes the title of the head of state of Afghanistan from Amir, short for Amir al-Mu'mineen, the leader of the faithful, an older Islamic term that goes back to the early centuries of Islam originally, albeit spreading in Afghanistan much more in the 19th century. But Amir Habibullah is replaced by Amir Amanullah, who declares himself then, during his reign from 1919 to 29, declares himself king then. So we have a shift, if you like, to a more dynastic rather than more religious and Islamic kind of notion of political authority, and that's being reflected here on the stamp. What we can also see going on here is post-Dolat Aliye Afghanistan, so the post of the kingdom, the kingdom of Afghanistan. So what we have here is the beginnings then of, linguistically, these kind of interactions that I'll be talking about more fully with regard to archaeology, art history, and numismatics and other intellectual disciplines as well. So, the third stamp then, just 3 years later, look how far we've come then from the insignia here in 1909, the shrinking insignia here then by 1927, and by 1932 then, we have the Bamiyan Buddhas on a stamp in Afghanistan. And to stick with my loan words as well, we have here Pusti Afghanistan, so the word post itself is changed then, the actual spelling, those of you might notice, from post to pust, and the loan words at the bottom then, we've actually got the rise of French rather than colonial English from next door in India. We have French influence starting to come here, even at the level of postage. And we're going to turn to the context in which this is happening, politically and intellectually, then these French influences there. This simply says Bamiyan. So we have here an image of the Bamiyan Buddhas by 1932. And what I'll be talking about as I go on today is how this happens. What are the intellectual changes that are happening within Afghan society, art historical, archaeological, that actually lay the context for then the state to have on its stamp the Bamiyan Buddha, something which would have been, I think, unthinkable even just a couple of years earlier. Well, a little of the background of the Bamiyan Buddhas. I'm not going to be speaking today, as I say, about kind of the period in which the Bamiyan Buddhas were built in the 6th and 7th century of the Common Era. I'm talking about, of course, of as it were, the discovery of Buddhism, Bamiyan and otherwise, in the modern period. This is a drawing that was made for the report by Sir Alexander Burnes, Bukhara Burnes, the British imperial spy, informant, traveller who subsequently died in Kabul during the First Anglo-Afghan War, was killed in Kabul during that uprising. And this image, and indeed his description of the Bamiyan Buddhas, made it through to an Iranian magazine printed in the late 19th century, the Sharaf magazine of Tehran, where I found this image some years ago, and indeed the description of the Bamiyan Buddhas came via Burnes's account of Afghanistan that found its way into Persian. So what I'm trying to signal here already is that even in the later 19th century, the beginnings of an appreciation of the history of Bamiyan, of that kind of pre-Islamic past, is taking place in a kind of a sense of, in a context of intellectual interaction between Europeans and Middle Easterners, in this case, Iranians. And we're going to see much more of that as I go on. Moving from the other side of Afghanistan's borders then, from Iran to the west to British India in the north, in the later 19th century, the Archaeological Survey of India had been founded, And in the later 19th century, we start to get excavations, or at least kind of the collection and the stockpiling, as I've called it here, of Gandhara art. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Gandhara art to some degree. There are, I think, about half a dozen pieces in the collection of the Asian Art Museum here, as there are virtually a number of pieces, probably in any decent museum collection anywhere in the world. There was so much Gandhara art found, and so much came onto the world art markets in the later 19th and early 20th century that it's a sort of a bit of became a sine qua non, really, of any art collection or a non-Western art collection in Europe and the United States. This is an image here that I was supplied by the British Museum, and we can get a sense here of a little sense. I think it's a wonderful image in its own right, but we can get a sense here of the sheer scale and the sheer number of statues that survived. The Gandhara region stretches particularly around the Peshawar Valley in northwest what's now Pakistan, what was then, of course, the northwestern edges of British India, reaching across into Afghanistan towards the region of Jalalabad. And in that sort of the valleys that stretch from Peshawar, now northwest Pakistan, through the Peshawar Valley, through to as I say, Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan, there were literally hundreds and probably thousands of Buddhist stupas built that were surrounded by these statues and via low reliefs, high reliefs, largely in schist, stone, hard stone, but also, and few of them have survived, in stucco. So in the later 19th century then, British excavators, if that's probably just about the right word, I guess, by the later 19th century, the Archaeological Survey of India, are starting to collect the statues. They go to the wonderful collections in the Lahore Museum, and of course that's part of those of you who've ever read Rudyard Kipling's Kim will know that that's some of the context there of that description of the Ajaib Khana, as the museum was called in Urdu, the House of Wonders. And I'll be looking, one of the things I'm interested in, and I hope will be of interest to you as museum visitors and docents, is the evolution of the notion and the format of the museum in these other contexts. I'll be talking a little bit about Istanbul, and of course more particularly about, and also about Tehran, but more particularly about Kabul. So the museum, the Lahore Museum, so a British Colonial Museum, the Calcutta Museum received large and really wonderful collections of this Gandhara material, and then more and more came onto the, as I say, into the world art markets. And it's in that context then that we start to have the emergence of the art history of South Asia, and particularly this art history that focuses on these Greek or European influences, was understood at the time, and in a much more nuanced way, I think it still is today. Interactions that were going on within Afghanistan as the legacy of Alexander's conquest and the foundation of these Greco and Greco-Bactrian kingdoms within Afghanistan. And I'll be talking about one of the key early, and probably the key early theorist and historian of Gandhara as he moves on from his later career from British India in the 1890s and moving to Afghanistan just after 1919 in the early 1920s. So again, the political context of these developments in Afghanistan, as I mentioned, Habibullah, this is his official portrait, and this is my photograph of it that I took in the National Art Gallery, founded again in the 1930s in Kabul, and an image here, a portrait of Amanullah. I mean, again, we get a kind of a sense here of these two modernizing and in some ways westernizing figures, but I prefer not to use that word. I think it's sort of westernizing suggests, as it were, a one-way cultural process. And I think what was going on in Afghanistan and other contexts was more of something more complex than simply, as I say, westernization. And I want to leave this slide here a little bit for you to sort of read through it. I will come back to it later on in the talk as well. And what we're seeing here is really kind of crucially the foundation of new cultural institutions during the reigns of these two figures. And these were autocrats. This was pretty much under the aegis, and I think it's probably not too sharp word to say, under the command of these rulers. The foundation of new cultural institutions in Afghanistan in the early 20th century, in the period I'll be talking about. And of course, again, as museum visitors, as museum docents, we know how crucial institutions are to cultural life. And what we're finding here in Afghanistan is the emergence then of what we would think of as recognizably European, or at least recognizably modern cultural institutions in terms of literary institutions, literary societies, historical societies, journals and magazines that spread into the public sphere, knowledge from there, and indeed, crucially, the museum itself. So first of all, though, what has to happen before there are staff, intellectuals, etc., directors for these institutions, and indeed people to be able to write in their publications, there need to be a new cadre of new Afghan intellectuals who are trained in a new way and indeed able to absorb, adopt and adapt and deploy for different cultural purposes the kinds of art historic and archaeological discoveries and arguments that are being made in Europe, i.e. Afghans that at the very least can read European languages, which is a novelty by the turn of the century, the early 1900s in Afghanistan. So first of all, we have the founding of this school, Habibiyya, founded by and of course named after the ruler Habibullah, and founded in 1903. The school was largely staffed by actual Indian Muslims who were educated in English, educated in more modern subjects as a result of that complex colonial encounter by which Indian Muslims had been absorbing all sorts of ideas from Europe throughout the 19th century, and again deploying them towards their own ends, and particularly the people employed at Habibiyya employing these European ideas towards the idea of modernizing Muslim societies. So we have the Habibiyya High School training young Afghans, educating young Afghans, not least in the English language and in kind of modern subjects, including history as it might have been taught in a European manner. The foundation in 1922 then, so we'll see that after 1919, Afghanistan is having this new diplomatic outreach to other places, particularly France, and the founding then of a lycée, so a French high school, a French high school named Lycée, or renamed at least, Lycée Istiklal, Lycée Independence. So again, that 1919 key moment of Afghanistan seeing itself as being fully independent in that period. The school founded in 1922, and again, as this diplomatic and political outreach to beyond Russia and Britain starts to come with interactions with Germany as well, which become Afghanistan's major political and economic partner in the 1930s and early 40s. We have the foundation then of not just an English medium and a French medium school, but a German medium high school as well, the Förderverein Amani Oberrealschule, so often known as the Amani High School, founded in 1924. Beyond this then, we start to have other institutions of learning then, founded in 1922 based upon an older kind of the Royal Cabinet of Curiosities, one might say, the Musée Milli, as it's sometimes called, the National Museum, otherwise known as the Kabul Museum, founded in 1922. And we'll note here that the word itself, of course, is coming from the French, musée, isn't it? So being taken into Dari Persian, into Afghan Persian, the French word for museum, then the musée becomes museum. The Anjumani Adabi, so which simply means the Literary Society, or to give its full name, the Kabul Literary Society, the Anjumani Adabi Kabul, founded in 1930. And that was modeled on the Académie Française, the French Academy, had been founded, of course, centuries earlier under the Eminence Grise of Cardinal Richelieu, if I remember correctly. And the ruler by that point, as we'll come to him a little later, Nader Shah, who becomes King of Afghanistan in 1929, had earlier been minister in Paris, had spent a good amount of time in France, had actually been exiled to France in the later 1920s, and he founds the Kabul Literary Society. And again, although it's called the Kabul Literary Society, it might as well be the Afghan Literary Society because it's the official state-founded institution, and then modelled upon the Académie Française. So this is as we'll see, it's this literary society that is interested in far more things than literature, although its early publications will include translations of short stories by Maupassant and other French writers. But within the guise of literature, this will be Afghanistan's primary intellectual institution, and particularly in terms of publicizing and printing articles on all manner of things, and for our purposes today on archaeology, art history, and indeed the French archaeological excavations in Afghanistan. And then in 1942 then, the founding of the Anjumani Tarikh, or the Anjuman-e-Tarikh Afghanistan, the official Afghan historical society, which will start to develop and promote then this new historical identity for Afghanistan that I've talked about, in which the Bamiyan Buddhas and indeed the pre-Islamic history of Afghanistan altogether will develop. And so much so then, to be creating a new historical identity for Afghanistan, to have another name, that Afghanistan as Aryana, as the land of the Aryans, and indeed this ancient kingdom. And publicizing then. So first of all, we have Afghans educated in European languages and kind of more modern intellectual disciplines and methods. They start to staff these new cultural institutions, and indeed then from those new cultural institutions they start writing articles that are published in the journals of those institutions, state-funded again, which reach out to broader society, or at least that small slice of Afghan society who were literate, and indeed literate in Persian, and then later these journals started printing, at least the second two started printing in the Pashto language as well. So Siraj al-Akhbar, an Afghan newspaper founded in the reign of Habibiyah, which means torch of the news, but it's also a play on one of the names of Habibullah himself. Remember, these are official state-sponsored publications. So Habibullah, one of his titles was Siraj ad-Din wal Millat, light of the faith and of the nation. So Siraj al-Akhbar, light, or rather lantern, I should say, torch or lantern of the faith. And the lantern or the torch of news is literally the name of the newspaper, but also a play on that royal name. Mujalla-e-Kabul, the Kabul Journal, founded in 1931 as the official journal of the Afghan Literary Society, and Aryana, so the same word in English, Aryana, that sort of, as it were, name for ancient Afghanistan that's being adopted in this period, then founded in 1942. So a few images then for us to get a sense of architecturally what these look like then. The Lycée Istiklal then, so Independence High School then, the French medium lycée, and again, for what it's worth here, we can see again, even these words then, the old Afghan word for a school then, maktab, although that's often used kind of colloquially for these schools, the official word used here on the sign then is adopting the French word lycée into the Persian there. And when we looked at that Gandharan stockpile, that archaeological stockpile, I mentioned that then there's a key scholar who will be playing, as it were, the intermediary role from excavations and art historical debates going on in colonial India and taking those into Afghanistan. And that figure is our French savant, Alfred Fouché. And Alfred Fouché traveled, educated in Paris by a Sanskritist, Sylvain Lévy, if I remember correctly, in Paris. And he travels in the 1890s to colonial India, makes his own kind of surveys, and they're not excavations. And as a result, writes his 3-volume work then, La Greco-Bouddhique de Gandhara, which is to say, of course, the Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara. And he's coining that term that we'll see come up again, that there's this notion then of art that is Greek and Buddhist. And why? Well, of course, again, as I mentioned, without going into the ancient history more than we necessarily need to, but of course this is the legacy of the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms, those kingdoms founded in the wake of Alexander's conquests in what's now Afghanistan and what's now northwestern Pakistan, of course, in the 320s BC. And the legacy of that then by the first centuries of the Common Era then were the Gandhara art then, or what Fouché is calling Greco-Buddhist art. And it's Fouché, the great popularizer and the great kind of, I suppose, kind of expander of that instinctive notion that I think others had in his context, but of course he documents it and argues for this idea much more fully across 3 volumes and his many other writings, that Indian or South Asian, indeed for our purposes Afghan, sculpture and art history begins, at least in its figurative form, through this intersection of Greek sculptural techniques. Later in his career, he seemed to think that it was actually Roman impact, but at this point, at least, he's convinced that it's the legacy of the Greeks in Afghanistan, and indeed in Gandhara, what's now northwest Pakistan, that create the impetus then, and that shifts Buddhist art from being aniconic, i.e. images of the wheel of Wheel of Dharma, for example, or of the Buddha's foot, into being iconic, i.e. kind of statuary near things that we know of, the images of the Buddha. Well, how does this start to relate to Afghanistan? Well, in 1922 then, as a result of this diplomatic outreach from Kabul to Paris, there's the founding then of the DAFA, so the French initials then, the Délégation Archéologique Française en Afghanistan, the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan, but it's always known by its French acronym, DAFA, founded in 1922 with the Franco-Afghan Archaeological Convention. This was really crucial because as part of the Afghan state-led attempt to maintain some degree of its own independence, to restrict British or Russian influence within Afghanistan, no archaeological excavations have been allowed in Afghanistan by either the British or the Russians to this period. Sure, there have been, kind of unofficial figures who traveled through, particularly earlier in the earlier mid-19th century, but there have been no anything like professionalized or even semi-professionalized archaeological excavations within Afghanistan. And so it was a very deliberate in some senses, insult or an assertion of the new independence of Afghanistan that the Afghan government then gave the first concessions, and indeed a 50-year, I actually forget whether it was a 30 or a 50-year monopoly, but nonetheless granted a monopoly to the French, not to the British or the Russians. And the figure then selected to head the French archaeological delegation of Afghanistan for 1922 then was our old friend, or rather our new friend, Alfred Fouché, along with a team that travels to Afghanistan in the early 1920s. There's a very rich archive of DAFA in Paris, including the personal archive of Alfred Fouché himself. He was a fascinating figure. He moved on to Japan by 1926 and did sort of comparative work there with Japanese Buddhism and the stuff that ends up in the Guimet collection that I'll turn to a little bit, the Musée Guimet in Paris. And I'm drawing on here on images from the DAFA archive that have been written about by two French historians, and in particular Annick Fenet, who has worked upon these archives and published them extensively and in her work. So what we're starting to see here, and what I'm trying to hint at then, is that even though these are, let's say it's the French archaeological delegation, of course, an archaeologist or people work on the history of archaeology are increasingly interested in local helpers, or indeed what I'll be talking about today, the local interpreters and adapters and deployers of these discoveries. So we're seeing here again with the French, but also various Afghan figures. And here, if I remember correctly, this is the site at Begram, which I'll be turning to in more detail today, and the excavations that are going on there, of course, that are, in many cases, it's Afghans who are actually doing the digging and much of the work, but we'll also see doing not just the hard physical labor, but the intellectual labor as well. So, early DAFA excavations, and a quick run-through, beginning in Balkh, where Fouché was, in which he was particularly interested, but without kind of huge success. That was, as I recall, really a surface survey rather than a full excavation. Petava, a lesser-known site that has, in some ways, disappeared off the map physically as well as figuratively. 1925, Begram. We're going to kind of come to that as well, particularly the discoveries in Begram in the 1930s, that site. 1926 to 28 in Hada, 1929 in Bamiyan. Recommenced in 1933. Well, I'll come to that in a little bit, because in 1929 there was a revolution in Afghanistan, and all things stopped. It was, in a sense, in some respects, a kind of in the sense that they were a kind of to some degree a pre-Taliban movement. We'll turn to that later. So some of the fruits and the lost fruits of these excavations. Then Jules Batu, then one of the members of DAFA, doing the excavations at Hada. To my mind, Hada, as I mentioned, so much of what we think of as Gandhara art is in this very hard schist, this very hard stone that one finds in the collections here at the Asian Art Museum, or indeed around the world. But the lesser known stuff, and of course less preserved because it's that much more fragile, but also of course that much more delicate in terms of what one can do with it, is the stucco work. And that the stucco is being used in various places in various periods. And some of it's still being discovered today, as we'll turn to at the end of my talk. But the materials found at Hada are really absolutely sublime. what we see here, perhaps the most famous of all images from Hadda, is there's a Buddha here, if we can imagine a Buddha or a Bodhisattva figure here, but what we have here is an adaptation, of course, of the Greek Heracles, being put here as it were one of the servants or the helpers or the, as it were, cosmic aids of the Buddha. That's destroyed. The whole site of Hadda was destroyed in the war, in the Soviet war, and indeed in the Civil War during the 1990s. So this stuff just does not exist anymore, tragically, and there's a great deal of it. What we have here are some of the things that do still exist, and much of what does still exist from Hadda is in the Musée Guimet. Because historians of archaeology in the Middle East, and indeed in the colonial world, and what was becoming from around 1920 in Egypt, in Afghanistan, and various other places, the post-colonial world, have seen 1920 or thereabouts as a watershed moment. That rather than be able to just, dig up and excavate and export everything, as happened in Iraq and the 19th century and so on, and in Egypt and other places, to be able to export everything to Paris or London or Berlin, there were the practice of partage, that's to say, dividing in half the finds between the foreign excavator institutions and local ones, that became pretty much embedded from around 1920 onwards under new archaeological conventions, whether in Turkey or elsewhere, and certainly within the DAFA, the French Archaeological Convention as well. So half of the materials went to Paris, and indeed that's the half, at least from Hadda, the stuff that's preserved in the Musée Guimet. And the Musée Guimet, at least institutionally, becomes the repository for so many of the things that the French excavators are discovering or unearthing within Afghanistan. Émile Guimet himself was a fascinating figure in his own right. He was a French industrialist, a connoisseur, or one might say an amateur, who was, having come from an industrialist family from Lyon, becomes an enthusiast, an amateur scholar of Asian religiosity, and is sent on a French official mission to study the religions of East Asia, and particularly Buddhism. He writes a book about Japan, writes several books, and becomes a collector in his own right during that tour to the East. And here's the famous portrait of him in the museum that he founded, the Musée Guimet in Paris, that was obviously founded in 1889 and then handed over to the French government, to the French state, a few years later. And that's where it still is now at Place Iéna, if I remember correctly, Place Iéna in Paris. I'm sure there are many of you here who have visited it. And if you haven't, do go to Paris, because you'll see so many of the things from the DAFA excavations still preserved there, as well as next door the Panthéon bouddhique, which is in a sort of an annex to the Guimet itself, the Buddhist Pantheon there in Paris, because it became a repository of Buddhist art, particularly the kind of stuff that Guimet collected on that official mission to study in Japan. But he was also buying a great deal of Buddhist statuary in Japan that he that set up in the original version of the Guimet Museum, his private museum. So much of that still survives today. So if you like, then what can see here, there's, if you like, a kind of a Buddhist art historical institution, and indeed orientation that's already been set up in Paris, which forms the context and the background for the French excavations. And of course, although France is brought into Afghanistan by the Afghan state as a non-colonial power, of course, it's a non-colonial power in Afghanistan, but of course it is a colonial power elsewhere in the Buddhist world, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Indochina or Indochina. And indeed, that's very much, of course, for sort of colonial collections, what one starts to have in the Guimet as well. And that's more post, as we can see, sort of the French stamp up there on this postcard. And these are some photographs I took on my last visit to the Guimet a couple of years ago. Then some of the Hadda stuccos that have survived there, of statues of devotees, and I think they're labeled as devotees and demons. So I guess these are the devotees and these are the demons who can pull off their heads and other freaky stuff like that. Now this is also a context then within the Middle East, and comparatively with Afghanistan, that museums are starting to spread elsewhere. And again, on that European model, and particularly on that French model. And I want to sort of, kind of place a little bit of museological context around what we're seeing going on in Afghanistan, that Afghanistan is by no means the the sole independent state that is trying to create its own national archaeological and art historical institutions, but also doing so through what are perceived of as neutral, at least non-directly colonial partners. We see that happening then with the foundation of the Musei Humayun, which is to say the Imperial Museum in Istanbul. And again, we'll note here that it's the French loanword that comes in again into the Ottoman and into Ottoman Turkish and indeed into modern Turkish. There are many French loanwords coming there. Those of you who have been to Istanbul might have visited the Archaeological Museum. While the Archaeological Museum is on the site and still, it's outgrown the original buildings, but it's on the original site and the original buildings of the Musei Humayun then. So the first museum founded in the Ottoman Empire, or at least in the center of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, and founded in 1891. And there we have an early photograph of it that I took when I was there a few years ago, and they actually had a wonderful exhibition on about the history of the museum itself. If I'm correct, I think this is some of the statuary from the excavations at Sidon in what was then Ottoman-controlled Lebanon that I'll turn to in a moment. And the key figures here are French and Ottoman interlocutors, like same kind of exchange that we're seeing going on with the Afghans. And this is sort of a crucial, maybe missing link, maybe not, that I haven't managed to uncover yet, and no one else has looked into yet, for good or bad reasons. And that's a possibility of not just a French, but an Ottoman or Turkish influence on Afghan cultural policy in this period. Because within a Middle Eastern context, Afghanistan's biggest partner was the late Ottoman Empire, and particularly the late Ottoman Empire in the early 1900s, which became the model for Afghan legal reform in the early 20th century. Faiz Ahmad, a Berkeley PhD, has written a book about that came out last year, I think it was now. But we don't know to what extent they're, if you like, kind of more broadly cultural rather than legal interactions with Afghanistan. Certainly, novels were being translated. The first ever novels, now to think of it, the first ever novels published in Afghanistan were very Persian translations of the novels of Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Bist Hazar Farsak Ziri Darya, as it was called in Persian. But they were based not on direct translations from the French, but on late Ottoman Turkish translations published in Istanbul. So maybe there are museological connections as well, we don't know. But certainly what I can confidently claim and show here today, of course, there are parallels. What the Ottomans were doing, the Afghans will be doing a couple of decades later. So the museum is founded then, 1891. They need a professional cataloguer for the various kind of classical finds. And indeed, these again, let's note that it's ancient history that's going into the museum, not Islamic history, as it will be in the early period in Kabul as well. And so we're having here sort of late Ottoman Turkish publication of the catalogue of the Imperial Museum by the French historian of his own works he wrote on Greek sculpture in the period of Pericles and so on, and he becomes the first cataloguer in 1311 in the Ottoman Islamic calendar, in 1895 in the Common Era, the cataloguer of the Imperial Museum, now the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul. And on the Afghan side, so we'll be looking at on the Ottoman side, we're looking at the Afghan counterparts to this famous figure here, Osman Hamdi Bey, who'd studied in Paris, studied to paint in Paris, and then becomes appointed. He was, from an aristocratic Ottoman kind of state-affiliated family. He becomes appointed then. He's not a trained archaeologist, but of course so few people were in the late 19th century. And arguably nobody was a trained archaeologist in the late 19th century. But he becomes appointed then as the first director of the Imperial Museum in Istanbul, and then moves on to learning how to excavate, in some ways learning on the job himself, by his excavations at Sidon in what's now Lebanon, still then an Ottoman province, and the famous necropolis there. And we can see his writings there, the Foy, that's to say the excavations of Hamdi Bey, and here's one of the volumes there, the volume, of course, with the images, but a multi-volume work then published in Paris. So again, we're seeing this kind of, this sort of intellectual exchanges between Istanbul and Paris that we'll see replicated in Kabul as well. And we'll see some of these kind of reflections as well, that it's not only, as I've promised you, archaeology, but also a bit of art history. And Osman Hamdi Bey had been trained in Paris as a painter. He's famous as as it were, the first Ottoman or the first Turkish archaeologist, but also in some ways the first, at least the most famous painter in the modern, at least kind of the European tradition. And he's adapting those European oil painting, portrait painting, historical painting techniques and adopting them for Ottoman or late Ottoman, in some ways kind of Ottoman Orientalism in its own right, these kind of subjects. And this is one of his more famous paintings in the Pera Museum in Istanbul, and many of them are in private hands. And we'll see again this sort of interplay a little bit with archaeology, art history, looking back at the past, the national past, or the imperial past in this case, in various ways. So switching to Kabul, we see here the Musée Milli, the National Museum, or more often known as the Kabul Museum. It's not entirely clear to me, and I haven't found it clearly stated in the scholarship, whether the original name, when it's founded in 1922, was Musée Milli, and this word Milli, national, is a really kind of key word in this kind of nation-defining nationalist period in the 20s, or whether it was originally called the Kabul Museum. Because we don't have any early publications from that period in the way that we have something like that from a very early catalogue from early in the period. We don't have anything that early from the Kabul Museum, at least nothing that has been brought to light so far. We'll note again, the architecture here is imported, it's European, it's part of the Dar el-Aman, the new royal city, the complex built in the 1920s to be the new capital, at least the new kind of government center on the edges of Kabul. And it was designed and built as a sort of Italian and increasingly kind of a German joint effort on behalf of the Afghan government. And these originally, as I understand it, bureaucratic offices, government offices then, which with the founding of the DAFA then, the French archaeological delegation that same year in 1922, they need a museum for the Afghan share of the partage, which is the Afghan share of the division of, spoils the wrong word, finds that end up there in the museum. So the museum's founded, and increasingly then, by default, because the French are doing ancient, pre-Islamic archaeology, the DAFA doesn't until if I remember correctly, the late 1950s or the mid-50s, doesn't do anything on Islamic art or Islamic archaeology. So what the DAFA is doing up is by definition pre-Islamic art. So Afghanistan's first museum is by definition then pre-Islamic stuff, although it will actually, even from the early period, have some Islamic items that have been part of the Royal Cabinet of Curiosities, as they've called it, that was transferred into the museum. Again, parallels with art history in Europe as well. Not in this case with Osman Hamdi Bey in Paris, but Abdul Ghaffar Badashna, Afghanistan's most famous and foundational modern artist, who was sent to study in Munich, where many American artists have been sent to study since the latter 19th century, reshaped American art, his historical painting, particularly landscape paintings in the later 19th, early 20th century, and the fame of Munich as an art historical, or rather as an art school, fine art center then, has this Afghan Abdul Ghaffar Badashna. Badashna was his pen name, it's a Pashto name, it means lightning or lightning bolt electricity in Pashto. He's sent to Germany in 1921, studies lithography, painting, and returns to Kabul in 1931. One of my graduate students, Marjan Wadaki, is actually writing a dissertation on these Afghan-German exchanges in which Badashna plays an important role. He comes back to Kabul, comes into government employment, and then subsequently founds the first school, or at least becomes director of the first school of fine arts in Afghanistan as well. And as we can see here, those German Munich school of historical paintings and so on are being reflected here in the kind of things that's been written of the kind of things that Badashna is painting in Kabul, scenes of traditional or historical Afghanistan. Museum founding in parallel as well, and more closely related to the Afghans and DAFA then, is the famous Musée Irani-Bastan. I know some of you have been to Iran. You will certainly have been to that. I think it's called the Ancient Iran Museum in English. I mean, that's pretty much what it means in Persian anyway. The Musée Irani-Bastan. And notably, even though the modernizing efforts of Iran are better known and at least more evident when visits Iran today rather than visits Afghanistan today. Nonetheless, it's notable that the Musée Irani Bastan was founded in 1936, 14 years after the Kabul Museum then, and actually designed by and has as its first director André Godard, who'd been working for the previous years in Afghanistan for DAFA. Nonetheless, I think what's striking that's happened in this interim is that the Afghan Museum there, as I say, seems to be, as I understand it, a leftover, again, this stuff isn't very well studied, a leftover government office, that something built as a government office then is just used as a museum in 1922, but is, very clearly in a European style. But what we have here, André Godard, is a French architect, in fact, although they've been employed by DAFA to do the architectural drawings, a French architect making the modern museum in Iran on the designs of ancient Iranian art and architecture and the Arch of Ctesiphon. I think that's correct. The Arch of Ctesiphon there being used here as the model then. So the Iranian one is later, but in some ways it's more Iranian, it's more indigenous, albeit designed by a French architect. A bit more political context in Afghanistan in 1929, then I'd mentioned that the DAFA's archaeological activities stop for several years in the late 20s and early 30s, and that's when a modernizing ruler, Amanullah, who's toured Europe, his wife has toured Europe. The New York Times was full of reports about his wife unveiling and wearing the latest 1920s fashions as she toured Paris. She was interviewed with Paris Vogue, etc. These photographs and news spread back to Afghanistan. It was at least one element in the rebellion of this figure here, Habibullah Kalakani, who was known to his enemies and known derisively by the nickname Bache Sakau, which means the son of the water seller, i.e. the son of someone from the lowest level of Afghan society who just sold water, carried around water heavily and sold it in the bazaar. But his proper name was Habibullah Kalakani. In contemporary Afghanistan, there's a reclaiming of him by many Afghan Tajiks as a kind of a claiming of a Tajik claims over the Afghan past and indeed the Afghan present, because he was the only ethnic Tajik to have briefly ruled Afghanistan in a modern era of entirely of Pashtun rulers. There he is seated on the left here with his sort of council of war and indeed his council of religion. And indeed the title he claimed himself against the modernizing constitution, modernizing laws and educational reforms of Amanullah, including the founding, I might have mentioned, of the first girls' school in Afghanistan as well, which becomes known as Lycée Malale. And that all of these things were overturned by Habibullah Kalakani. The girls' school was closed. The museum collections were, as far as we know, were destroyed, or at least partly destroyed. So that's why I call him in some senses a precursor to the Taliban. And indeed, he called himself as his royal title, not king, indeed not a royal title at all. His official title, he called himself, Habibullah Kalakani, was Khadimi Rasulullah, which is a servant of the Prophet of God, servant of the Prophet Muhammad, trying to bring back a more Islamic form of rule then, that, as I say, kind of seems to have included closing the girls' schools and destroying the statuary. Well, he's ousted by Nader Shah, an ethnic Pashtun, for what that's worth. More importantly, is I like to see history not in ethnic terms, but in other, hopefully more, kind of happily interactive and connective terms. Then that Nader Shah had spent time exiled in Paris, exiled in the south of France rather, but he'd actually lived in Paris. It was him then who comes back to Afghanistan, overthrows the rebellion of Habibullah Kalakani, and among other things then founds the Kabul Literary Society that I mentioned. He doesn't last too long. He's assassinated himself by one of the students of the new schools, who, if I remember correctly, had been sent to university to higher studies in Germany. He's assassinated in 1933, and there's his mausoleum. So again, we can sort of see this. Afghanistan, this period is becoming a real mix of what do we do architecturally? What is our architectural, our art historical, our cultural identity? And we have here, this is one of the photographs I took it's on one of the mountains outside overlooking Kabul, and it's really rather starkly, very much a kind of a modernist, brutalist, one might say, piece of architecture there, albeit, of course, taking in some local elements into its design. And I think actually reflecting the kind of monuments that have been built in Pahlavi, Iran in this period as well. So let's go back. I don't want to go through this all again, but let's quickly look at this list of new cultural institutions, and we're going to turn, particularly now, we've looked at the museum, now we're going to turn to the Literary Society then, modelled on the Académie Française. They've been founded by Nader Shah, 1930, and then we'll turn to the Afghan Historical Society, founded in 1942, and indeed their publications is listed there below. And I'll just briefly introduce those now very quickly, and then we'll continue with these after the break. So we have here then, we can see here again this kind of French influence then. This is the first publications then of the Literary Society, that literature is being organised and nationalised, and it's more than just literature, as we'll see. And these figures here, and they're kind of, as we can see, there's kind of very much a modern dress, albeit modelled on some kind of attempt to Afghanise, nationalise this modernity with karakol hats based upon, of course, the famous karakol wool, Afghanistan's biggest export in this period, being exported to Germany in particular. And, of course, even though this is the Persian journal, the name of the literary circle, as it's being called there, the office of the Literary Circle of Kabul there in French. And I'm going to turn in the second half of my lecture then to how that Literary Society then becomes the channel through which the French archaeological discoveries are being then adapted and made meaningful for Afghans in the making of a new history and a new historical identity for Afghanistan itself as ancient Ariana. Okay, well, enjoy your break, and I'll continue in the second half. Continue now, and we're going to start looking at, having looked at the context and the French role, we're going to increasingly look at the Afghan role in the reception and the redeployment then of this pre-Islamic art history and archaeology, and archaeology-based, indeed numismatic, coin-based history of Afghanistan that creates a new historical identity for Afghanistan then, that, as I say, the Taliban were struggling against in their internal culture wars then. That was the other less recognized side of the rationale, so to speak, if that's not entirely the wrong word, for the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. So we have the founding then of the Literary Society of Kabul. And a few people in the break have asked me about languages in Afghanistan. The lingua franca, the shared language of Afghanistan, the language in which into the 20th century the only language that people would be educated to read and write in was Persian, Farsi, known in Afghanistan as often as Dari, D-A-R-I. So Dari is the Afghan version of Persian. So when I say Persian, Dari Persian, that's the language. That's the language of most of the intellectuals, and indeed of government and of the state. Pashto is another major language of Afghanistan, and although Persian is the lingua franca, spoken as the shared language by people of all ethnic groups, particularly in towns and particularly in Kabul, Pashto is the language really only spoken by Pashtuns. So it's, if you like, an ethnic or community language rather than a shared language, by ethnic Pashtuns, sometimes known as Pashtuns. But since many of the key figures who ruled the state, and all of the rulers of modern Afghanistan, apart from that Habibullah Kalakani and the 1929 rebel, they're all ethnic Pashtuns. As the 20th century went on and the nationalism and nation-building process went on, their attempts to promote written and indeed printed Pashto, and the magazines and journals I'll be looking at, although the texts I'm looking at are in Persian, because that's what I can read, they did actually start to try to build, if you like, kind of a cultural capital, or if that's an apt term, by printing in Pashto as well. But the stuff I'm looking at today is in Persian, Afghan Persian, Dari. So the founding of the Literary Society then, and we can see here a few figures I'm going to look at then. Although it's called the Literary Society, it published even articles on the motor car, on all sorts of things, as well as I said, translations from Maupassant and other European writers. It has its historical branch. And the figures that I'll be talking about today mostly are this gentleman here, the head of the historical section, who becomes Afghanistan's chief official historian, and is an ancient historian. We'll learn more about him. That's Ahmad Ali Kohzad, whose brother was living in the Bay Area, and I hope still is. So there are the Afghans of the Bay Area connections here too. But I'll be talking about his more French and European connections. And this figure here, Yaqub Hassan Khan, members then of the historical branch of the Afghan Historical Society. So Yaqub Hassan Khan in 1936 then, so we've moved forward a bit. The French they've been in Afghanistan since 1922. They've started their excavations, as we've seen, through the later 20s. And by the mid-30s then, we start to have, in the early and particularly the mid-30s, remember the literary society isn't founded until 1930/31 anyway. And so it's only in that decade that we start to get the translations of their reports, and indeed the founding then, the creating of a new type of history that we see here in the title of this work, which is Nagahi bi Tarikh Qadim Afghanistan, which is a glimpse at the ancient history, Tarikh Qadim Afghanistan. And that's a new kind of concept, actually, that there's a branch of history that is the Tarikh Qadim, that is ancient, i.e. pre-Islamic history in Afghanistan. I've written about this in some detail, and my various publications actually on this kind of stuff are online and free and downloadable on my Academia EDU website. So I won't go into close readings of any of these texts, but if any of you are specifically interested, that's in some of my articles online. So what's happening then, what we find is actually that French school that's been founded has created Afghans, educated Afghans who can speak French. Two of them here become very famous historians in Afghanistan, the 20th century historians in a sort of a modern sense, using new methods and techniques, including archaeology, numismatics, documents, other languages, albeit, like Chinese and so on, albeit often translated into French and accessible via French. Sayyid Qasim Rishtiya here on the left, who translates the French reports of DAFA and starts publishing those then in the Kabul Journal, the Journal of the Literary Society, and Ahmad Ali Kozad, who we can see here on the right, who will rise up to be Afghanistan's chief official historian. So he's born in Kabul in 1907 to a non-Pashtun family, to a family of Qizilbash, who are a group of Shia, larger community that emerges in Afghanistan in the 18th century, become close to the state, in many ways still are, but kind of not from the Pashtun group. He graduates, and as I've said, from the Lycée Istiklal, so the French lycée, and becomes a translator then to the DAFA, so is, as it were, the middleman between the French and all of their local workers, and indeed of the local enablers, government officials and so on, becomes the translator there in a very practical sense in the mid-1920s, and then joins the Literary Society in the early 1930s, and as we've seen, becomes the head of its history branch. Here there's an early image of him here, Ahmed Ali Khan, there as with Jean Cal, one of the DAFA excavators there in the French, not so much excavations, but survey that they did in Bamiyan in the late 1920s. And he starts then to write not just translations, but increasingly his own sort of digestion, his own take, his own interpretation of the French findings then. There's no point, I thought I'd just show you the text, so I'm showing here some of the illustrations. And this is important because the new technologies, as it were, the apparatus of art history in a very physical sense. These new printing machines are being imported. The first printing press is being brought in from British India at the end of the 19th century, at the turn of the 20th century. And by the 1920s, there's links with Germany, where art history in its modern sense begins, of course. So aptly, they're bringing in printing presses of more modern kind that can print photographs like this into Kabul from Germany. So we have the kind of Hellenistic, if you like, the kind of the Greco-Buddhic, as Alfred Fouché would call it, and being displayed here in the article, the digest, the translations, the accounts of these discoveries that Kozad is making. He's also turning to coins as well, to numismatics, which start to become a new source for history, and indeed a new source for Afghan history, or indeed for Afghan ancient history, that new notion of the Afghan past, of Afghan historical identity that's developing this period. So here in the Kabul Annual, rather than the Kabul Monthly Magazine, he gives this account of what we can see of these the Greco-Bactrian coins, including of Eucratides, that we'll see this figure here, and this coin being redeployed in another interesting way as we move forward. The Goddards, then remember we'd seen Andre Goddard going on to design and become the first director of the Ancient Iran Museum, the Musée Iran Bastan in Tehran. Well, he'd earlier prepared this report on Bamiyan, and that's translated by Kozad and published by the Literary Society in Kabul, complete with the various images and the drawings and the photographs that Goddard had taken. And then, so we're starting actually to see then, remember that although the first motor roads are being built in Afghanistan in the early 30s, indeed 1937, this year, coincides with the publication of Robert Byron's famous travelogue of Afghanistan, The Road to Oxiana, in which it really is about, although he's an art historian, Robert Byron, and that's a wonderful book, you might, if those of you haven't read it, The Road to Oxiana, road is really crucial, because it's actually a story of doing art history based on be able to go on the motor roads that has been built across Afghanistan. But still, nonetheless, for most Afghans, particularly intellectuals in places like Kabul who are reading the magazine, the Kabul Journal, they're never going to go to Bamiyan. It seems to be dangerous, it's far away, they haven't got cars anyway, even though a road has just opened. So this is their first access to, this is their history, not just part of, in a sense, the folklore or the ethno-history of the local Hazara community that lives around Bamiyan and had lived there for centuries. So again, Goddard's images from Bamiyan are being redeployed here and shown to an Afghan literate audience, an Afghan educated audience for the first time, becoming aware of Bamiyan, its artistic wealth, and indeed Kozad is trying to make a case that this is their heritage, that this is the heritage of the Afghans, and indeed, you know, he's actually trying to create an art historical terminology in Dari Persian to explain these paintings and indeed these statues, and using the term mujassama, a statue, a more neutral term than the more familiar everyday term of a but, literally a word coming from the Sanskrit that we get the word Buddha from, but meaning an idol in a pejorative sense, not a but a mujassama, an art historical terminology then he's deploying. So by 1937 then, we have a really crucial event then for that. Up until this point, it's really been, you know, the archaeologists and these few Afghan interlocutors that are finding these Greco-Buddhist sites, or indeed Bamiyan, or making surveys there. But the most important site that really puts Afghan archaeology on the map overseas, but also promotes the importance of ancient history within Afghanistan, are the excavations being made by DAFA in the late 1930s at Begram, not too far from Kabul, about 50 miles from Kabul, the site of the major Russian, Soviet, then US air base, but more crucially for our purposes and for Kozad's purposes, the capital of the ancient Kushan Empire, which stretched all the way into across what's now India, into Bengal, and westwards and northwestwards as well. And the capital of that great ancient empire, it's realized then it was Begram, which is to say ancient Kapisa. Now, this is really important for Kozad, and indeed becomes at the center of his vision of ancient Afghan history, that Afghanistan is the center of an ancient civilization. And that word, civilization, that kind of key word in European art historically, indeed historical discourse, in Western Civ becoming such an important American, you know, kind of education, historical art, historical otherwise, is being deployed by late Ottomans and being deployed by Iranians, Indian Muslims, and then increasingly then by the 20s and 30s by Kozad and by Afghans to say, we have an ancient tamadun is the word they use. They're creating a neologism for this loan word, civilization. We were the center of an ancient tamadun. We weren't on the edges of the Mughal Empire. We weren't just on the edges of the Safavid Empire of Persia and the Mughal Empire of India. In ancient times, we were the center of a great empire that ruled over our neighbors and wasn't ruled by them. And Begram, then, ancient Kapisa, is the center of that. It's also, of course, hugely important in art historical and archaeological terms for the discovery then in 1937 of the Begram ivories. Kozad may have been present at the discovery itself, at the excavations at the period, through his work with DAFA. I think some of you have seen, if not the ivories, but some of the other, possibly the ivories, some of the other Begram treasures that toured in that great Afghan exhibition that came to the Asian Art Museum here and toured around whole world about whenever it was 6 or 7 years ago. They toured for several years. And these are, of course, hugely important. But I'm not so much here today to discuss these in the ancient period, but what they start to do in the modern period. The Roman painted goblets then, the glasses, the ivories, which were part of boxes and chairs, it seems, and largely imported when Begram was, so to speak, kind of the center geographically of the Silk Roads. And these become very important within Afghanistan itself, as I'll show in a moment. And it's actually with these, the Begram excavations seem to be, according to the DAFA's records, seems to be the first time that Afghan state officials bother to actually come out and get their boots dirty by going out into the countryside, by going out to Begram, leaving the capital in their comfortable quarters of the new bureaucratic district of Dar el-Aman, and take a real interest and fascination in these finds. And that's happening overseas as well. The Musée Guimet in Paris discoveries in Afghanistan and French colonial Indochina. And again, it's kind of this Buddhist stuff, but also this artistic renditions of the kind of stuff we're seeing on the Begram ivories there, the art of the steps, and here and of course the excavations of the DAFA during their campaigns, and again these ivories from India that were discovered, the Begram ivories. So there's a big archaeological sensation in Paris and internationally, but crucially within Afghanistan. These excavations then, Hafriyat Jadid, the new excavations in Afghanistan, and this is Kozad then making his reports, explain to educated Afghans what these discoveries are and what they add up to. And crucially, he's printing these images as well from the Begram ivories. And as we can see, these are, they're art historical images, but of course they're also, so to speak, very graphic images. And I think he's very brave and courageous here. This is the beginnings of art history in Afghanistan in a sort of a modern sense. And it's also the beginnings of printing and image printing. And there's not really a great deal of printing of any females with hijab, etc., as well in this period, let alone images like this. So I think he's taking a great risk, not least that a few years earlier, clerics and mullahs had even complained about the image of the Buddha on a stamp. So there we are. But he does, nonetheless, do so under official protection. Remember, the Kabul Historical Society is the official state literary and cultural society. And what's more then, he follows up his articles then with, I think, a very clever career move as a still by then young historian, by writing 2 accounts of the Kushans to become his earliest monographs. The Imperatori, so again borrowing a European loanword, the Empire of the Kushans, and a monograph on Begram. And he publishes those the year after the discovery of the Begram ivories, capitalizing on government interest, and indeed starting to create then, to actually bring the discoveries then of the DAFA and to say this gives us Afghans an ancient history, that we were the center of a world historical civilization. The Indians, the Iraqis have got their stuff, they've got the discoveries have been going in colonial India of Mohenjo-Daro, etc., particularly in a decade or so earlier. Now the Afghans are not on the edge of empires, they're at the center of a great ancient empire and indeed a civilization. I mentioned the importance of art history as well, and those the Afghan trained in Germany, and we start to have this sort of Art Deco takes on antiquity of various paintings being made in Afghanistan in the 30s and 40s. Indeed, Kozad, when he's appointed a few years later as the first director of the Afghan Historical Society, founded in 1942, he's also appointed as head of the Kabul Museum. And he actually opens up at the Kabul Museum what he calls, being French educated or French medium educated in Kabul, the Salon d'Automne, to say the autumn salon, which one would have in kind of Parisian museums and galleries, in which he displays in the Kabul Museum not just the works of ancient Afghans, so to speak, because they're now being nationalized and claimed and conceptualized, the ancient Buddhist findings and so on, and the Kushan era findings, but also then the paintings being made by modern Afghans. I'm sorry, this is a poor photograph. I took it in the National Gallery in Kabul, so it's got this glass and reflection on it. Again, this is part of this radical revisionism of Afghan history that is not just the more familiar history of Afghanistan that Abdul Ghafur Barishna, our Afghan painter trained in Germany, with his historical Munich school paintings of the foundation of the Afghan state here, with the crowning by the Sufi Sabir Shah of Ahmad Shah Durrani, the empire builder and the founder of a modern state based on and in Afghanistan. But it's something much more radical than that, of creating Tarikh Qadimi Afghanistan, an ancient Afghan history in which Afghanistan, as I said, is the center of empires. I want to very briefly to give you a sense of how radical this revisionism was and how radical this pointing to ancient and archaeological and numismatic sources was when we look at Afghan historical writing up until this point, up until the 1930s. The earliest work of the history of the Afghans as Afghans, if not quite written by an Afghan, but certainly patronized by the Afghan notable Khan Jahan Lodi, who was actually living in India, in the Mughal India, where Afghans had migrated for centuries as part of the Mughal Empire and indeed the Delhi Sultanate. This text, Persian text sponsored by the Khan Jahan Lodi, as I say, an Afghan notable, the boon companion of the Mughal Empire, Jahangir, in around 1615, the Tarikh Khan Jahani, i.e. the Khan Jahan's history, otherwise known as the Makhzan-e Afghani, the Afghan treasury. And this is actually a genealogical history of the Afghans. If as an Afghan, which in this period just means a Pashtun, if you want to know who you are, how do you know? You look at the genealogies of your tribal history, and that will tell you who you are, who you're related to, what your past is, and that's traced back to the progenitor, the primogenitor of Afghans as a people, Pashtuns as a people, and Afghan history. And the primogenitor of the Afghan people and Afghan history then, according to this text, indeed, as a model it sets for centuries into the 20th century, is a figure called Qais Abdul Rashid Afghan. So Qais Abdul Rashid, the Afghan, who was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, who migrates to Afghanistan and becomes the ancestor then of all the Afghan peoples. Afghan history then, Afghan historiography, Afghan historical writing, Afghan historical identity is genealogical, tribal genealogies. And there, that's from the modern printed edition, has those genealogies mapped out. And versions of the Tarikh Khan Jahani, or its shorter version, the Makhzani Afghani, were manuscript versions, went all around colonial India, into Afghanistan, and shaped Afghan historical writing into the 20th century. The other mode of Afghan historical writing, if it wasn't genealogical, it was dynastic. The history of Afghanistan isn't social history, isn't the history of the different peoples, the different places. It's the history of the rulers and their achievements, their conquests, their battles, such as the Taj al-Tawarikh, the crown of histories, in this kind of regal, kind of dynastic name that was written for, or some would even written for, by the court secretary of Amir Abdul Rahman, the ruler of Afghanistan from 1881 to 1901, and was actually printed in colonial India in Lahore because Afghan printing hadn't really developed at that point. So we've got Afghan historical writing right through here to the end of the 19th century is either genealogical, it's dynastic. So nothing to do with Buddhists or the ancient past or anything non-Islamic or indeed even non-Pashtun at this point. Even into the 1910s and 20s, the last traditional chronicler, the last of the writers of these types of history, although he made various innovations in documentary terms in his own right, but nonetheless still writing in this style of history, in this text that, again, using the dynastic name Siraj of Habibullah, his royal patron, Faiz Muhammad Khatib, writing the Siraj al-Tawarikh, the torch of histories. And again, one of the key sources he draws on is that early text, the Khan Jahan's history that had been written 4 centuries earlier. So when in the and indeed, as late as 1929, Faiz Muhammad, the Afghan historian, himself an ethnic Hazara, Faiz Muhammad Khatib, albeit working for Pashtun dynastic patrons, his last work was known as the Najadi Afghan, the sort of the roots or the genealogy of the Afghans, or indeed the Afghan race is a literal translation in modern usage, written as late as 1929, was still entirely based on genealogical history on the model of the Tarikh Khan Jahani from 1615. So that mode of history was still carrying on as late as 1929, late as 1930, when the DAFA is ongoing. So what we have with Khozad, and as we see in Yaqub Hassan Khan, creating now Afghan history as Tarikh Qadim, it's ancient, it's pre-Islamic. And indeed its sources aren't the genealogies and the memoirs of tribal memorialists, if you like, remembrances. Nor is it even archaeology, nor is even history based upon the kind of Persian and Arabic court documents that Faiz Muhammad Khatib draws on in a kind of Rankian sense, in a sort of documentary, professionalized sense. No, it's nothing to do with Arabic, nothing to do with Persian, nothing to do with paper, nothing to do with tribal memories. It's about coins and statuary and material culture, as we would say now. So he's writing then this, his monograph, the first text in Afghanistan that I'm pretty sure it is the first text. No one's ever found an early one. I don't think they will. He writes an early article, as we've seen, on coins, and then a monograph on numismatics. Maskuqat-e Qadim Afghanistan, ancient coinage of Afghanistan. And the introduction to that, he actually gives an account of how coins help us do history. Coins tell us things that paper documents that haven't survived cannot tell us. In very much the same way that, of course, so much of the ancient history of India had been reconstructed in the 19th century based upon coin findings. And I mentioned before the importance of Eucratides. I was going to call it Eucridites, but apparently that's wrong. Classicist term. Eucratides, didn't slip off the tongue so easily. That coin that I mentioned earlier and showed you earlier, this finds a new deployment and a new life here in 1939. I'm grateful to Llewellyn Morgan of Oxford University, a classicist there, who actually pointed the existence of this logo out to me, that in 1939 then, with the founding of the Afghanistan Bank, the national, kind of state bank of Afghanistan, as part of Afghanistan's international interactions, and we can see even the term bank has been taken over. The institution, the notion of a bank and state finances, and indeed the loan word itself as part of that. So much so that sometimes it's spelt with a long A, with the letter Aleph in Persian at this time, bank, and sometimes just bank. And I think that's whether the loan is coming from English, bank, or the French banque. So, even the spelling is uncertain in Persian, in Afghan Persian at this time. And the image that's used then is one of these ancient Greco-Bactrian Greek coins of Eucratides. And there we have. And the logo there at the top, the Afghanistan Bank, the foundational date in the two calendars, 1839. And I don't read Greek, but if I recall here, it's on Basileus, so kind of king or whatever there, or great ruler, and his name there, Eucratides. Unfortunately, what hasn't come out here, and this is really interesting to me, is what we can see here actually cornucopia. We can see there an image from a coin itself. And what we have here then is a deployment then of these numismatic finds. There have been a couple of great big hoards found in a few years earlier in Afghanistan. Then those hoards are what Khozad is making his catalogue from in 1938. The following year then, one of the coins illustrated in there becomes the logo of the bank. But it's not the facial front of Eucratides. It's not this ancient Greek, this foreigner who's ruling the country. Khozad has actually written a play in French, Alexandre on Afghanistan, in which he's celebrating not the Greeks, they're foreigners. He's celebrating the Afghans who are resisting, as it's seen there. The ancient Afghans are resisting the Greeks. So he doesn't want some there's some Grecian ruler, Eucratides, or indeed the officials who found the logo. They take this image of the Dioscuri then, the kind of this image here of two Greek, the twins, but here as warriors, that look, they could be plausibly Afghan, like Afghan mounted warriors. And here again, to my mind, not part of the coin, of course, but to my mind, this is a symbolism of national wealth, absolutely, horns of plenty, but it's also of archaeological treasure. Our ancient treasures now, our ancient wealth of our ancient empires are now being part of our new nation state and its financial institutions, the Bank of Afghanistan. Well, I was very curious as to know where Khozad was finding his numismatic knowledge from, insofar as this wasn't part of, the working historian's practice in Afghanistan in this period. And as I said, in his numismatic manual, his numismatic monograph, he gave an introduction to Afghan readers of why coins tell us things, how and why coins tell us things about history. And the one text he quoted in there is this book by François Lenormand, who was the keeper of the Cabinet de Monnaie Médaillon in Paris, and wrote this 2-volume introductory work. And guess what is the only Afghan coin that's in there? Surprise, surprise then, it's our, not exactly the same issue, but basically the same coin then of Eucratides, and that's what's in there as well. And then that finds its way from France into the manuals of Kozad, and then ultimately to be what is still today the official logo of the Bank of Afghanistan. So Kozad's in these various ways, they're institutionalizing a new Afghan historical identity. He becomes, he's appointed, as I mentioned, in 1942 as the first president of the Afghan Historical Society, a role in which he keeps until the early 1960s. He founds and edits the monthly Persian language journal then, so the main lingua franca, Ariana from 1942, and then also for broader international outreach, the Afghanistan Quarterly. And I'll just flick through a few final images now of what that journal, those journals look like. The Buddhists come on again in 1948 on Greco-Buddhist art, and finally the Buddhists return to the postage stamps in 1951. Books on folklore that he writes with Ria Haquin, the wife of one of the French archaeologists, and then further discoveries being made, and all claimed as part of ancient Afghan history, particularly Kanishka, the famous statue of the great ruler, the great emperor of the Kushans, that was the lesser-known victim of the Taliban, destroyed in the Kabul Museum in 2001, and there it is. But what I hope I've shown you here is that the way in which Afghan official history, state history, was institutionalized and completely reinvented then to create a new national history that's promoted not just through the museum and the Historical Society, but ultimately then through radio programs that Kozad and then others did, and ultimately inspires school textbooks, inspires the name of the Afghan national airline, Ariana, the national news agency, Bakhtar, i.e. Bactria, and the names of many Afghans, particularly secular Afghans or Afghans named in the 1960s and 70s, with names like Ariana and indeed kind of other ancient names that were being resurrected in this period. So I shall stop there and leave a good quarter of an hour for questions, but thank you for bearing with me.